Now for today's program. Uri Kaufman is a graduate of New York University School of Law and is an award-winning real estate developer specializing in adaptively restoring historic buildings. He has worked on his book, 18 Days in October, the Yom Kippur War and How It Created the Modern Middle East, for over 20 years, visiting the battlefields, speaking to participants, and reviewing literally thousands of pages of material. Moment contributor Dan Raviv was a CBS News correspondent in Israel, Europe, and Washington for 40 years, and then senior DC correspondent for Israel's I-24 News. Dan is the author of books about Israeli espionage and diplomacy, including The Spies Against Armageddon and Every Spy a Prince. Please welcome Uri Kaufman and Dan Raviv.
Suzanne, thank you very much. Thanks, Suzanne, and always happy to be here on behalf of Moment Magazine and its fine series of Zoominars. And as you see, we're joined by an author, Uri Kaufman. And unless you're very different from me, you never heard of Uri Kaufman, which is fine. I mean, again, this is a real book cover. I have to admit, I was reading the book on my Kindle, but it's a real book from a real publisher, Macmillan. 18 Days in October, about the Yom Kippur War. Here we are at the 50th anniversary of that frightening war in 1973. But Uri, I hope you don't mind if I start with the basic question. Who are you? Where did you come from? I mean, I haven't seen other books about the Middle East from you.
Well, there's always a first, and that would be this one. I've always been fascinated with Israel. I was there for 2 years as a student. I speak Hebrew, taught myself Hebrew, been following it, I could even say obsessively since I'm a teenager. Mostly, I just like telling a really good story. And the Yom Kippur War is unquestionably one for the ages. If I'd have brought this to my editor as a novel, she'd have just kicked me down the stairs. Nobody would believe that this could happen. It's literally got everything: the swashbuckling General Ariel Sharon, the suspense, the intrigue, Sadat's right-hand man selling secrets to the Israelis. And then above it all, you've got this incredible, extraordinary woman, Golda Meir, the first woman in the history of the world to rise to lead a nation without being related to any male politician or king by blood or marriage. It's really just got it all. No novelist could have ever dreamed up a story like this one.
Now, I was surprised, and by the way, you just have to believe me, folks, this is a very readable book. And if you're of a certain age that, well, to put it frankly, if you were alive and aware of the news in 1973, this will resonate with you. It'll spark so many memories, but it's filled with inside stories that, again, Uri Kaufman, part-time historian, managed to dig up, find, and what is it based on? A lot of interviews with Israelis who are still alive? Is it archives? Is it only Israeli archives? What are your main sources?
So it's a combination. To do this properly, you really need to be able to speak 5 languages: Hebrew and English, Russian, and Arabic. And then, because the East German Stasi had a large presence in Syria, and because it's so hard to get any good information on Syria, you got to speak German as well. So I don't think there's anyone on the planet who speaks all 5 of those languages. I only speak 2 of them, Hebrew and English. So I hired a bunch of researchers. I had one in Russia. I had one in Ukraine, who actually quit on me to join the Ukrainian army. I had one in Germany, 2 in Israel, and then 1 or 2 in America at various times. And between us, we gathered up what I have to believe is pretty much every piece of paper that's out there. I'm sure a lot of this information was looked at for the very first time. There were a lot of interviews, a lot of reviewing. I can even say thousands of pages of records, newspaper articles. Speaking to people, of course, is always going to be important. But most importantly, it's the information that was released just in the last maybe 10 or 12 years that really is what gives us insight as to what the decision makers were thinking. And that's what I really wanted to focus on.
Now, especially for younger viewers who are joining us, and I certainly hope some are, you've heard of the Yom Kippur War. Israel was taken by surprise on Yom Kippur, Saturday, October 6th, 50 years ago. Taken by surprise. Okay, later when we learn more, there'd been information from a Mossad spy in Cairo, really close to Egypt's President Sadat. He happened to be the late President Nasser's son-in-law. And there was information that the Mossad had that Egypt was about to attack But Israel's military intelligence agency rejected it, said, no, it can't be. They had their preconceived notion that the Arabs, having lost so badly in 1967, the Six-Day War, would never do that, would never attack. So that's the beginning. It looks like Israel taken by surprise. There are a lot of subtleties, gray areas, and I want you to fill in, but that's what so many of us think we know. Israel had a horrible time, lost more just in soldiers and uniformed personnel, more than 2,500, I believe, dead. Horrible blow to little Israel, and the fear that Israel was losing, but within 3 weeks, Israel was winning. All the time watched, managed by the superpowers. The Soviet Union was supplying weapons to Egypt for sure, and also to Syria. And the United States was watching President Nixon, Henry Kissinger, his Secretary of State, and then the famous resupply that seemed to save Israel. Golda Meir persuaded Nixon and Kissinger to send everything so that Israel could survive, and by most accounts, so Israel could win. Now, that's a general story, but one other thing. If you were here in the United States or some other Western country, you also suffered the Arab oil embargo at that time. That's right, Israel had been attacked, and yet the Arabs who led the OPEC oil cartel felt they were hard done by and declared an embargo and wouldn't sell any oil to the United States and its allies, the U.S., after all, being on Israel's side. So those are the things that we've known for 50 years. Uri, give us some highlights about things you found out or things you highlight in 18 Days in October, that a guy like me maybe didn't know. You found out some new details.
Yeah, well, there's a lot of new details. One of them is that Golda was actually lied to by the general in charge of military intelligence. It was actually touched upon briefly in the movie Golda that was released recently.
The one with Helen Mirren playing.
The one with Helen Mirren, correct. I have to say the screenwriter Nicholas Martin did a really, really good research job on his own. But what happened was the Israelis had a series of listening devices deep inside Cairo. They were known as the extraordinary measures. They allowed Israel to listen to conversations really at the highest level. The problem was the extraordinary measures ran on a battery. And with the technology of the day, the battery drained very quickly. So usually the Israelis had to keep the extraordinary measures turned off. They only turned them on under circumstances that were, well, extraordinary. Before the war, in December of 1972 and in May of 1973, the Israelis had warnings of a potential attack, but they turned on the extraordinary measures. They said there would not be an attack, and so they never mobilized. And the extraordinary measures turned out to be correct. So within Israel, they were known as the national insurance policy. Well, you get to late September, early October, it looked like something was afoot. And the men who were in command of the extraordinary measures, I actually spoke to the commander of the unit. It was a colonel named Yossi Langotsky, very, very colorful guy. He pleaded with his boss, the head of military intelligence, a man named Eli Zeira, to turn them on. Zeira was so positive there would never be a war that he refused to turn them on, but he lied to Golda, Defense Minister Moshe Dayan, and the Chief of Staff, David Elazar. He said he had turned them on and that everything was fine. So they were lulled into a sense of, whatever you want to call it, comfort that nothing would happen because they were told the extraordinary measures said nothing would happen. So that
even though that Mossad spy, the well-placed man in Cairo, the Egyptian, had warned the Israelis, and Zeira was that a turf battle because he was the head of the military intelligence and the spy was the Mossad's guy?
That didn't happen. It wasn't quite as clear as that. What really happened was Marwan did not warn the Israelis in October until the night before, only about less than 12 hours before the attack.
Again, that's one of those things that, again, the publishers would say, I'm not going to buy that in a novel. Don't tell me on Kol Nidre Eve that the head of the Mossad flew to London to meet with President Nasser's son-in-law in London. Give me a break. But that's what happened.
But that's exactly what happened. And then he went running out into the street in London at midnight, and he couldn't get a phone line back to Israel because it was Yom Kippur. And whatever the arrangement they had made had failed. So he's like hitting, we all remember what the old phones looked like, and he's hitting the receiver, and the operator said, "I'm sorry, sir, but I can't get you a line. It's some sort of holiday in Israel. Why don't you try calling tomorrow?" He said, "I have to speak to them now." So he finally got through. The real question is, well, if Marwan was a spy for Israel, why did he wait till the last minute? And this has fueled some of the theories that maybe he was actually a double agent, someone sent by Egypt to fool the Israelis. Of course, the response to that is, well, then why did he give any warning at all? He could have just remained quiet. And an Israeli spy master, a man by the name of Rafi Eitan, I think put it best. He said, you have to always remember there are no double agents. There are only triple agents. There's the nation they serve, the nation they betray, and then there's that highest loyalty of all, which is to themselves. In other words, Marwan was still an Egyptian. He was only in it for the money. So his goal was to give the Israelis the minimum amount of information he needed to keep the money flowing. And that's why he did what he did and only warned them at the last minute. And that's
just to put a button on the Ashraf Marwan story, years later, he falls off a balcony in London to his death. And everyone's speculating, did the Israelis kill him? I really doubt it. Did the Egyptians kill him? May well be. But he was given a hero's funeral in Cairo because the Egyptians never wanted to admit they were fooled by a Mossad agent. That's my reading of it. I would say the Israelis say they got tons of info from that man and paid him a lot of money.
So here's what we know. According to published reports, the Israelis gave him $20 million in adjusted for inflation, 2018 dollars. To put that in perspective, the highest paid spy in American history that we know of was Aldrich Ames, and he only got $4 million. Espionage is not a well-paying industry, by the way. Take a lot more money than that to get me to risk sitting in jail for the rest of my life, which, by the way, Aldrich Ames is now doing. Now, after the story broke, whole story about how that happened, after the story broke, Marwan traveled to Egypt in late 2003 and was seen smiling with Egyptian officials. So that caused a lot of people to think, now, wait a minute, maybe he really was a double agent. But then he, quote unquote, fell off his balcony. And of course, he didn't fall off. He was thrown off the balcony. There is absolutely no way the Israelis did it. The Israelis, first of all, they publicly denied it, which they never do. Also, they would never kill someone on British soil. I mean, when they kill people, they do it in Malta, they'll do it in Syria, they might do it in Dubai. They are not killing anybody on British soil. That would just be really, really out of character for them. It's a near certainty. It was Egypt that killed him. He was a spy for Israel. It's tremendously embarrassing to Egypt. You have to remember also, his son married the daughter of Amr Musa, who was the foreign minister of Egypt and the president of the Arab League. Or the Secretary General, I forget what the title is. So he was literally living at the pinnacle of Arab society. He was a business partner with Mohammed Fayed, who was, of course, the father of Dodi Fayed, who was killed with Princess Diana. You can't make this stuff up, by the way. I mean,
a total insider, as you put it. And again, I want to button that up to move on, but with a little bit of a remark about the present day. It's not impossible to believe that, to be frank, the Mossad has similar agents and informants in other Middle Eastern governments and high society, and yes, even in Iran. I mean, how do you think the Mossad even located a warehouse full of nuclear secrets and got them out? They have very high-level agents. But let's go back to your book and the Yom Kippur War story, because Marwan's warning wasn't believed. The head of military intelligence, General Zaira, as you say, lied to Golda Meir. Do you mind if I want to just skip ahead to after the war, when there was a commission of inquiry, the Agranat Commission? I believe that commission in the end was not hard on Golda. They put most of the blame on the military intelligence, General Zaira.
So they did. The Agranat Commission actually got most of it right. First of all, it runs to 2,200 pages, the findings. It is a model of clarity. Even someone like me, who frankly never served in the military, was able to understand all of it. Their factual conclusions have all survived the test of time. There's not one, a few very minor details turned out to be wrong, but practically everything in there they got right. I think they also got it right in terms of their conclusions for most of the participants. They blamed Zaira and they sacked him. I think he got off easy. I think he should have been court-martialed. Lying to your superiors, that's a crime. They also sacked the theater commander in the Southern Command, a man named Shmuel Gonen, known by his nickname Gordish, because that was his given name. They let Dayan off and they let Golda off. I think that was actually correct, because remember, they were investigating the failures in the first days of the war. They really were not to blame. Where they failed, in my opinion, and in most people's opinion, is the way they treated David Elazar, the chief of staff. They were incredibly harsh on him, very unfairly so. It's possible that Dayan was behind the whole thing, that he hoped, Dayan did, that if all the blame was heaped on Elazar, he would walk away scot-free. And so this is in the book. Golda's stenographer said in an interview 6 months before she died that she witnessed Dayan saying he would support the commission, but only if a man named Chaim Laskov was a part of it. Chaim Laskov was a previous chief of staff of the Israeli army, and he was very close to Dayan. And it's known that they were leaking information to Dayan every day. He was being told testimony and things like that. So it might have all been engineered. I'll just say one final thing. I managed to track down one member of the Agranat Commission, a man named Moshe Landau. This is in the early 2000s. I somehow got his phone number. Landau was most famous because he presided over the trial of Adolf Eichmann. He was unfailingly polite to Eichmann. He even conversed with him in German during the trial. He was born in Germany. But when I started asking him questions about the Agranat Commission, he started screaming at me like nobody's business. So I think I obviously touched on a nerve. And I asked very polite questions like, well, why did you rule the way you did? Why did you reach the conclusion? And man, did he unload on me. I think that pretty much speaks for itself. I think on some level they knew that an injustice was committed.
And it continued for years, its conclusions to be so controversial, but as you say, clearly written. And it was a 9/11 type commission in which what was taken as a series of mistakes had to be explained. But let me turn to you about Moshe Dayan. You're tough on him in the book, the hero of the 1967 Six-Day War. I'll silence that in a second. And famous for the eye patch, of course, but you portray him as quite a self-centered operator.
Well, he was those things, but as I also say in the book, he is the one person responsible more than any other for the Israeli army as we know it today. There's two Israeli armies. There's, the BMD and the AMD before Moshe Dayan and after Moshe Dayan. When he became chief of staff in 1953, he changed the whole culture and turned it into the aggressive fighting force, creative, always attacking, winning wars in 6 days that we know today. So, it wasn't easy, writing, frankly, some unflattering things about him, unquestionably.
Well, let's say you said he was a womanizer. You said that he stole antiquities, was always selfish about that. Oh, and you said he's a misanthrope. He didn't like people. What else you got?
Well, that pretty much covers it. But you have to remember, the eye patch wound was just an absolutely hideous injury. He didn't just lose the eye, but the entire eye socket was smashed, and he was in constant pain from it. So his personality was, I thought, similar to the accounts I've read of people who had gout, in the Middle Ages. He was irritable. He didn't like people. He often said that the reason he liked digging for antiquities was that it took his mind off the pain. And you have to remember also, the standards were very different in those days. It was legal. Meir Shamgar, who later rose to become the Chief Justice of the Israeli Supreme Court, wrote in his memoir that everything Dayan did was legal, that they investigated it. You were just allowed to do those things in those days. I also heard from an antiquities dealer that it actually turned out to be a blessing for the country because they bought the collection for only $1 million, and it's all in the Israel Museum today. And he said it would have cost $20 million to gather all this material. So you got to look at the whole picture.
It was in Moshe Dayan's backyard most of the time.
Yeah, it was in his backyard most of the time. Yeah.
Now, what about, how did you firm up the story that, of course, was secret, that in the discussions during the most frightening early days of the Yom Kippur War, Moshe Dayan, defense minister, tells Golda Meir and maybe others there in the bore in the underground decision
bunker.
room in the bunker. We should use the nuclear weapon. We should use the nuclear weapon because the third temple, representing the modern state of Israel. Well, anyway, what quote did you decide to go with? Who did he say it to? And are you certain that he said it?
So first of all, he never said, let's use a nuclear weapon. This, just to be clear. What he did say was he wanted to prepare the nuclear weapons. It took about a day to get everything teed up for use. Of course, if you do that, it's a near certainty that foreign intelligence services are going to figure that out. And then that just takes the crisis to a whole other level. We know this because a lot of key people, like, for example, Shalhevet Fryer, who was the head of the Israeli Nuclear Agency, gave interviews. A lot of the people gave interviews like a few months before they died. They wanted to get that story out before they no longer could. So a lot of this information, again, it only came out in the last couple of years. There was a guy by the name of Avner Cohen who wrote a very, very controversial book about Israel's nuclear capability. He couldn't travel to Israel for many years as a result. Eventually, he traveled there and dared them to arrest him. A very, very gutsy guy, if you ask me. And
it's, of course, a history of Israel's atomic
nuclear
bomb
program, right. And one other point, after the war, David Elazar, the chief of staff, who was known universally by his nickname Dado. So if you hear me say Dado, I almost instinctively want to say that. Dado Elazar had a meeting with American generals and said that if the Syrians had penetrated into northern Israel, they would have used nuclear weapons. So the threat, was there. Now, it's not clear the Syrians would have continued past the Jordan River. We don't really know one way or the other. But
most people in telling that tale, Uri, say that it shows that Moshe Dayan was a wreck. He was falling apart. It was some sort of mental collapse. What do you feel was going on?
So it's impossible to say for certain. It all turns on how one defines mental collapse. So there's three schools. Those who want to find a quote unquote mental collapse, there's a lot of evidence just in the fact that there was a lot of mental illness in the Dayan family. His sister committed suicide. His children had drug problems. His grandchildren had drug problems. So one can seize on that. Others say he was overly pessimistic. Chaim Israeli, who was a legendary director general of the defense ministry, said that. But there are others who say, no, he was a realist. It really was that bad. So an Israeli general named Rechavam Ze'evi, known by his nickname Gandhi, said, no, he was right. They were losing weapons at a pace that simply was not sustainable. Given the burn rate, within 2 weeks, Israel would have been without planes and tanks. So yeah, he actually reacted properly, said Gandhi. So who's right, who's wrong? It's kind of hard for me to say. I would not say it was a mental collapse, though.
Okay. What do you write about the notion that Nixon and Kissinger saved Israel?
So that is true. But it was like what Winston Churchill says. They did it after all other alternatives were exhausted. Here's what happened. First of all, Nixon was not really functioning at that time. This was October of 1973. This was when Watergate metastasized. It was also the month in which his vice president, Spiro Agnew, became the first vice president in American history to resign, and it was over corruption. So this was when Nixon understood, wait a minute, this was a Saturday Night Massacre happened, and he knew that, his time was coming to an end. So he had something of perhaps a mental collapse of his own. Kissinger was calling the shots. The breakdown is very simply like this. From October 6 to October 9, you can't blame him for anything. The Israelis didn't really ask for weapons. And even if they had, everyone thought Israel would win the war without any trouble. So why supply them during the war when they probably won't need them anyway? You can always supply them after the war and then not anger the Arabs. On October the 9th, Kissinger found out just how bad it was. He slow-walked it between October the 9th and October the 12th because he wanted to hold Israel's feet to the fire and get them to agree to a quick ceasefire. But what rescued Israel was on October the 12th, Anwar Sadat very foolishly turned down a ceasefire proposal. And that's when Kissinger picked up the phone, called Brett Scowcroft and said, Brett, time to start pouring stuff in there. If the Arabs think they're going to defeat an American ally, they are mistaken. And then everything changed. So from October the 12th onward, the American response really was extraordinary. I actually recently got a call from a retired two-star general, a General McCoy Smith, who said that they immediately scrambled a whole squadron of F-4s and flew them from North Carolina all the way to Israel, trailed by a plane, a flying tanker, so that they could refuel in the sky. And as far as he knew, it was the longest flight ever in American history for any flight squadron. So once Kissinger said, time to supply Israel, the response was extraordinary. So yes, they did save them.
And not just ammunition and bandages. Those aircraft were immediately gifted to Israel.
Yes, they were. And that was what they needed more than anything else. They were losing planes at a rate that was not sustainable. They also sent a lot of tanks. And yes, tank ammunition was really maybe the most important component of all, because tanks without shells are just a bunch of metal, and they were running out of tank shells.
So don't blush, because again, I'm going to remind everyone watching, we're talking about 18 Days in October, the book about the Yom Kippur War. It's by Uri Kaufman, who is not a professional historian. He's not a military guy. He's a real estate developer who's done this in his own part-time for 20 years, his own fascination. But listen to the level of detail and individual stories and personal tales, and it's always told through the characters. And now I want to mention that early in the book, the beginning of your book, I'm not in 1973, which a lot of authors would have done. I'm in the Six-Day War in 1967, and then after that, I'm in the so-called War of Attrition in the Sinai, in which the Israelis and the Egyptians would lob shells at each other, and sometimes with impunity, Israel's Air Force would easily hit Egyptian targets. And so all of that increased this Israeli sense of total dominance after the Six-Day War. That's important, right? Because when the threat appears in 73, Israelis don't believe it. But tell us about the Soviet angle, better planes, better anti-aircraft. How did the Soviets change things?
So the fundamental core fact of the Middle Eastern battlefield is the Israeli Air Force. The fighter jet is the wonder weapon, then as now, that allows this tiny little country, no bigger than New Jersey, to hold off combined populations that, well, in those days, Israel had a population of a little more than 3 million, not much larger than Brooklyn, New York. The Arabs, depending on which countries you count, had combined populations of greater than 80 million. So how do 3 million people hold off 80 million? The answer is the fighter jet. Israel and the fighter jet were just made for each other. That is the great equalizer. They were able, the Israelis were, to fly with impunity all across Egypt, bomb targets at will in ways that were just unbelievably humiliating to the Egyptians. They had to move their war college out of the country because it wasn't safe there. Just one example. The Egyptians
didn't you write that the Israelis at one point, I guess using helicopters, crossed to the Egyptian side of the Suez Canal, meaning in Africa, in Egypt, and stole what, a Soviet anti-aircraft radar or something like that?
Yeah, they showed up and just hauled off like a 4-ton radar, strapped it onto a helicopter, took all the manuals and everything, and just flew it across to the other side. It was just incredibly humiliating. They killed the Egyptian chief of staff during the War of Attrition. There was one mission where they just drove up and down the coast, killing everything, including the sector brigadier general. It was just an incredible humiliation for the Egyptians every which way. The War of Attrition was a complete fiasco for Egypt. And again, it just showed how, because there was no planning, because they just went into this war without thinking it through, and this all happened under Nasser, they kept suffering these horribly humiliating defeats. When Sadat took over, things changed, at least from Egypt's perspective, for the better. He got himself an incredibly competent general, a man named Saad Shazli, probably the best general the Israelis have ever faced. And he sat down and he thought out a really, really well thought out plan.
What about the Soviets? How did they change things? What did they give Egypt?
So what they gave Egypt that was the game changer were surface-to-air missiles. The SAM-2, the SAM-3, and the SAM-6. Those surface-to-air missiles devastated the American Air Force in Vietnam. It was a SAM missile that shot down John McCain, for example. And it finally allowed the Arabs at least a partial solution to the Israeli Air Force. I say partial because the range of those missiles was pretty limited. It only reached about 6 miles east of the Suez Canal. There's about 120 miles from the Suez Canal all the way to Israel. So we're talking about a very small sliver of territory. So Saad Shazli, the Egyptian general, said, okay, we've got this problem. It's called the Israeli Air Force. We have got to deal with that problem before everything else. In war, the main thing is making sure the main thing stays the main thing. So he said, we're going to advance 6 miles and then we're going to stop right in the middle of the desert. It sounded a little suicidal because most military offensives are to get to an easy defensible place, a river, a ridge line. He said, forget about that. We don't have that luxury. We cannot go further than the umbrella that the surface-to-air missiles give us, and then we'll fight a war of attrition. And the plan worked like a charm. It's when they abandoned that plan that Egypt got into trouble.
By wanting to do too much in the Yom Kippur War. But there's the military side of what their ambitions were. What about Anwar Sadat, who we know later is a peacemaker with Israel's Menachem Begin, daring to visit Jerusalem? Incredible in 1977. And then the peace treaty between Egypt and Israel. What do you know about Sadat and his true ambition in even launching a war in 73?
Sadat made his intentions as clear as any leader could. He wanted to recover the lands that the Arabs lost in 1973 without giving Israel a peace treaty. That was always his goal. Now, it is true that before the war, he presented terms for peace. He became the very first Arab leader to use the P word, peace, and it was a bombshell. That was the good news. The bad news was the conditions. He might as well have conditioned it on pigs flying. He said he would sign a peace treaty if, first of all, Israel withdrew from all the territories everywhere, including not just the Sinai Peninsula, but the Golan Heights, even if Syria did not give them a peace treaty, also Judea, Samaria, also East Jerusalem, and the Kotel. But wait, we're not done yet. In addition, said Sadat, Israel also had to solve the Palestinian problem. And just to make sure that could never happen, he sat down with Palestinian leaders and said, do not settle under any terms, no matter what. So it is obvious, at least to me, that what Sadat was doing was what I called yesmanship, the fine art of trying to make it look like you're the one saying yes, so that the other side gets blamed. And that's actually what ultimately happened. But he had no interest in making a full peace, signing a full peace treaty with Israel before the war.
It was a military move to regain the entire Sinai, or to change the balance of things, call attention to this crisis, get Moscow and Washington to know that the Arabs really wanted their land back? Again, was he trying to capture the whole Sinai?
He was trying to capture the Sinai without giving a peace treaty. And the thinking was, if he could just get over the canal and then wage a war of attrition, and he knew, as everyone knew, that Israel is a reservist army. They could not afford to be on a war footing more than, a few weeks at most. And also Israel is very sensitive to casualties. And if he could do that and get the Arabs to impose an oil embargo, he could get America to pressure Israel, and then maybe he could get what he wanted without giving a peace treaty. It actually almost worked. It was a very well thought out plan. What did him in was he didn't follow the plan all the way through to the end. He tried to get a little ambitious and conquer it and go outside of that umbrella of the surface-to-air missiles.
You're giving me the impression that we certainly had years later, when he'd be interviewed by Barbara Walters and Walter Cronkite and make peace with Israel's Menachem Begin, that Sadat was a very smart man.
He was a very smart man. And when he first took over, people were just so dismissive of him. Elliot Richardson represented America at the funeral. America did not have diplomatic relations with Egypt at the time. So they sent a relatively low-level official. He came back and said, this guy Sadat is not going to last more than 6 weeks.
Meaning Nasser's funeral, of course. Yeah.
Correct. When Nasser's funeral, I'm sorry, I should have made that clear. He said Sadat won't last more than 6 weeks. Kissinger, well, there was a very controversial book in the 1970s by a guy named Mati Golan. It was supposedly premised on secretly taped conversations of Henry Kissinger. He claimed that Kissinger called Sadat a buffoon. Israel's intelligence services wrote horrible things about Sadat. He was dumb, he was weak, he was et cetera, et cetera. He was none of those things. He was brilliant. He was much more clever than Nasser was.
Which of course makes me give you the opportunity to explain part of your book's subtitle, 18 Days in October, the Yom Kippur War, and how it created the modern Middle East. I look at the modern Middle East, especially with Israel at the center of our storytelling, and see more Arab countries have accepted Israel, have diplomatic relations with Israel. UAE, Morocco, Bahrain, Saudi Arabia might do it. Wow, what a game changer that would be. But Israel has a mortal enemy called Iran, which is very well armed, has a huge population, and obviously has been working on nuclear weapons. So, how did the Yom Kippur War lead to this?
It's real simple. The first country, some country had to go first. One of the Arab countries had to be the first one to say, we're going to put this aside and we're going to accept a Jewish state in the Arab Middle East. And you're old enough, and I'm barely old enough to remember just what a revolutionary thought that was. And the first country, it just had to be Egypt. There is absolutely no way a country of the size of a Jordan, a United Arab Emirates, a Bahrain, a Sudan, a Morocco, those are the 4 Abraham Accord countries. There is no way that any of those countries would have signed a peace treaty with Israel if Egypt had not gone first. Once Egypt broke the ice, it paved the way for other countries to follow. And now here we are all the years later, and we're really finally seeing a complete sea change in the relationship between Israel and the Arab world. I would argue that the Abraham Accords were more significant than the peace treaty with Jordan, not the one with Egypt. That'll always be the most important. But the one with Bahrain and especially the Emirates, I would argue was more significant with Jordan because it was the first time that an Arab country said, no, wait a minute, we really want to have a warm relationship with Israel. The peace between Israel on the one hand and Jordan and Egypt on the other has been called cold peace because they've always kind of kept Israel at arm's length. United Arab Emirates already does about $2 billion of trade with Israel, and we're only, not like 3 years away from the signing of the Abraham Accords. They've made it clear they view Israel as a partner, as a trading partner, as a place where they hope tourists will come. And now we're seeing, at least so far from what's leaked out, that the Saudis seem to see the Israelis in the very same way. So
let me be clear. Let me be clear where your mind is, though, because again, you're saying the Yom Kippur War led to Israel's acceptance. So am I missing a little part in the middle here? Like Sadat had to fight this war so that 4 years later he could accept Israel and go to Jerusalem and address the Knesset and break all the ice.
That's exactly right. Because Israel won the Yom Kippur. Egypt, the Arab world would not have signed peace treaties without Egypt. Egypt would not have signed the peace treaty without losing the Yom Kippur War. And the reason—
Now, let's be clear. Egypt doesn't admit that it lost the war. This is your assessment and that of others, because after 3 weeks of sweating bullets, as they say, right, resupplied by the United States, General Ariel Sharon being bold enough to cross the Suez into Africa, into Egypt proper, and then there's the encircling of Egypt's key Third Army in the Sinai that the Americans were able to accomplish. And I think the Soviets told Kissinger to tell the Israelis, don't starve those Egyptians. Is that a human factor? Or don't humiliate Egypt? I mean, there's a lot going on where I think a lot of the parties were thinking about the future, whether they realized it or not.
I think we're giving them more credit than they deserve. I sometimes wonder, Henry Kissinger always argued that, he knew all along that he was setting the stage for the peace treaty. I think it was more, they were terrified of the embargo. And if Israel had destroyed the Egyptian Third Army, first of all, it might have really led to a confrontation with the Soviet Union. But I think the Arab world would not have been so quick to forgive America and lift the oil embargo. I think that was what really drove them. But the result of the Yom Kippur War was the Egyptians accepted a deal that Moshe Dayan had offered them before the war. Before the war, this was known as the interim agreement. Moshe Dayan said, okay, there isn't going to be a peace treaty, but we don't have to be shooting at each other. So he said, we in Israel will pull back 30 miles from the canal if you, Egypt, pull back 30 miles west of the canal, especially the surface-to-air missiles. If Egypt withdrew the surface-to-air missiles, they'd have no answer for the Israeli Air Force. But Dayan, in effect, said, we will let you open the Suez Canal if, in effect, you give up any military option. Sadat rejected that, at least before the war. But after the war, he accepted it. He accepted it because he understood there was no longer a military option. So now Israel had positioned itself exactly the way it wanted to. Egypt now had a stark choice. Make peace with losing the 1967 lands or make peace with Israel. Sadat wisely made peace with Israel. He got back the Sinai Peninsula. Hafez al-Assad in Syria and his son Bashar refused to make peace with Israel, so they never got back the Golan Heights. It can now be said with near certainty that they never will. That's really what the Yom Kippur War did.
And they're still festering in anger there. And of course, Syria then had its long civil war. It's broken apart. Assad has survived, but with U.S. troops and Russians in Syria and Iranians and Hezbollah, and it's just a crazy place. Whereas Syria could have been, well, frankly, in much better shape if it had gone ahead with part of the new wave that you're describing. Because I want to know whether you're feeling very optimistic that Israel now has established its permanence. At the time of the Yom Kippur War you've written about in your book, Israel was just 25 years old. Now it's 75 years old, and again has open relations with more Arab countries. All of this makes you optimistic about Israel?
I am incredibly optimistic about Israel. This is, to me, almost like the end of days, the Messiah coming. It's breathtaking. I mean, I say to myself sometimes, there have been about 150 generations of Jews going back to King Solomon, 3,000 years, 20 years a generation, something like that. We're the luckiest one. If you think about it, since the days of King Solomon, us Jews, we've never had it so good. Israel is not just free, it is a powerful country. It is one of the world's wealthiest countries, getting wealthier. We have all the freedoms, of course, living in America. We have gained acceptance. The Arab world is embracing Israel. It does look like there'll be a peace treaty with Israel and Saudi Arabia. Of course, we don't know for sure. If Saudi Arabia signs, it's a near certainty that Oman will sign. And then probably, again, this is all kind of cautious, but there's a good chance you'll see a number of the other Sunni countries sign. And you'll probably get to where a majority of the countries in the Arab League will now have peace treaties with Israel. So there are 21 countries in the Arab League, not counting the Palestinians. A bunch of them are never going to sign a peace treaty with Israel because they're aligned with Iran. I call it the Ark of Ruin: Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, and Yemen. They've made it clear, even if the Palestinians sign a treaty, they're just not going to do it. There are several others, Kuwait and Qatar also. They're kind of closer to Iran. They maybe not, but all the others are talking like they really want to. Even Libya, or at least the Tripoli government. Yeah, the Tripoli government in Libya wants to. So it's a different world. The idea of the Arabs wiping Israel off the map seems to be pretty far away, at least right now.
I was recently in Qatar, not for the first time, and they're so proud of their links with Iran, both diplomatically and economically, but they also host the largest United States Air Force base in the Middle East. So Qatar wants to play both sides there. Adding relations with Israel to the mix, maybe too much, would ruin their friendship with Iran. That's a Qatari view for what it's worth. But things change as the years go by. Not here to court controversy, and just ask you to just say briefly, so I know, many of our viewers who are concerned about Israel know that every Saturday night there are big protests against the Netanyahu government and issues of judicial reform and Netanyahu's right-wing partners. So some people now are moving toward pessimistic. Will Israel be a strong democracy with all these incredible divisions? Will the Israelis, if left alone, be able to find their own solutions to this?
The answer is a resounding yes. There's been all this talk about, there's going to be a civil war. There's not going to be any civil war. What we are seeing in Israel is what happens in every democracy every 5 to 10 years. You've got this emotional issue. People are out in the streets. They're protesting, but it's nonviolent. It's all peaceful. And by the way, in France, it seems like it happens every year. One year it's yellow vests, and one year it's fuel, and one year it's pensions. And it's a controversial time. Yes, Israel has seen this sort of thing before. I'm old enough to remember disengagement, how controversial that was.
Getting out of Gaza.
Yeah. Getting out of Gaza. I remember how controversial Oslo was. I remember how controversial it was when it looked like Israel was going to do a deal with Syria and give up the Golan Heights. And wherever you went in Israel, there were stickers, Ha'amim HaGolan, the nation with the Golan. I'm not old enough to remember the really ugly controversies, which were, I do remember the first Lebanon war. That was awful. Someone was killed. Someone threw a grenade. Yonah Vrashmi killed a guy named Emil Grunzweig. I remember it well. If you go before that, there were some really dangerous times. There was the controversy over whether Israel should accept compensation payments from Germany. That was very controversial, almost led to violence. And then, of course, the big one was the Altalena affair, where 16 Israelis were murdered by other Israelis. There really was almost a civil war back in 1948. Israel's been through much, much worse than this. They're going to work it out. I don't know how that'll play itself out. And by the way, it's going to be a democracy one way or the other. Whichever one they choose, it'll be one kind of democracy or it'll be another kind of democracy. It's not going to be a dictatorship.
And from our real estate developer in New York, who is now an accomplished historian. You've been listening, you know that. Let's turn to Suzanne Borden of Moment Magazine, who's been harvesting your online questions. Suzanne?
Yes, thank you so much for that wonderful, wonderful conversation. There's some very interesting questions from people who actually fought in the war. Someone says, I participated in the Yom Kippur War under the command of Ariel Sharon. After we crossed the Suez, we were involved in strange maneuvers, mostly at night. Our unit drove and made circles in the Sinai Desert. We were told that the purpose for these strange maneuvers was to cheat the Soviet spy satellites. Does any of this make sense?
Well, you kind of contradicted yourself there. I'm not sure. You said in Sinai, but I thought you said he crossed. I couldn't quite follow that. I'm not sure which one it was.
No, I'm thinking that the fellow, did cross with Ari.
He crossed the Suez Canal.
But
beforehand, he did that.
Before that, he did that. Okay, well, I'll tell you this. Ariel Sharon is the guy who won the war for Israel. It is, I think, the best story in the book. I'll ruin it, though. What was the whole problem for the Israelis was they had to lay a bridge. And the only way to get that bridge to the canal was through a particular road. And that road traveled through a place called the Chinese Farm. To say the Chinese Farm to an Israeli is like saying Gettysburg to an American. That's where the decisive battle of the Yom Kippur War was fought. The way the Israelis finally broke through was west of the canal. Ariel Sharon launched an unauthorized attack that fooled the Egyptians into thinking there was this huge offensive taking place west of the canal. The Egyptians were startled, so they withdrew further north away from the Chinese Farm and away from that road to straighten their lines. And they thought to meet this big offensive that Ariel Sharon was launching. So Sharon launched what was, again, an unauthorized invasion. That's what makes it so fascinating. And that's what won the war. So to hear the questioner say, we were doing these strange things to fool people, yeah, that is what Sharon kind of always did and did so well.
Thank you. Someone wrote in late December of 1973, I traveled to Israel on a UJA college leadership mission. The men in our group met at 3 a.m. and traveled from Tel Aviv across the Suez Canal near the Bitter Lake and back. We saw the surrounded Third Army. Was this dangerous at all?
Yeah. I would not have written that life insurance policy. Let's put it that way. Throughout 1973, right to the end of the year, everyone thought fighting was going to break out again at any moment. And in fact, Dayan at one point is thought to have said to one of his top generals, a man named Yisrael Tal, to come up with a provocation so that he could restart the war and wipe out the Egyptian Third Army. But Tal refused to do it unless he got written instructions from the government. And Tal, therefore, it is thought, was denied being made chief of staff of the Israeli army by Dayan. So it was a very dangerous time. There was a war of attrition going on as well. 15 Israeli soldiers were killed in the Sinai, or along the Suez Canal, I should say, in the period after the ceasefire was signed on October the, 25th, going till the end of the year, or it was maybe like 20 to 24th, until the end of the year, 15 Israeli soldiers were killed in skirmishing. So I won't tell that gentleman's Jewish mother that he was a naughty boy, but not a very wise thing to do.
Mm-hmm. What was the German angle and involvement in this story?
The only German involvement was that, well, let's put it this way. Syria is not quite North Korea, but it's pretty darn close to it. It's almost a hermit kingdom. There was an American diplomat years ago who said that there are never more than 3 or 4 people who know what's going on in Syria at any given time. It's a very, very, very difficult place to research. It is so difficult to research that my researchers in Russia told me if the Soviet advisor, the former Soviet advisor, served in Egypt, they'll talk to us. But if they served in Syria, they won't talk to us. I don't know how they have this, veil of silence over everything. It's almost like omerta. The one exception is that at that time, the East German Stasi had a large presence in Syria. And God bless the Germans, they are great record keepers. Whether it's agricultural statistics or the Holocaust, everything gets written down. So I had a German researcher go through the old Stasi records to see if we could get some good information. And there was some good information in there. Wasn't quite as good as I'd hoped. The Stasi records from the 1960s are actually a lot better, but there was some good information in there.
Mm-hmm. Somebody asked about the Israel attack on a Navy ship that killed soldiers. I think they're referring to during the 67 war, the USS Liberty.
Yes.
Can you say something about that, what that was and what happened there with Egypt?
Yeah. So real tragic event. An Israeli force accidentally fired on an American spy ship, the USS Liberty, which was operating legally. It was in international waters.
During the 6 days of war in 67.
During the Six-Day War, spying is legal under international law, so America was completely in the right. Sadly, a lot of chains of mistakes. It's been looked at many, many ways. There are a lot of conspiracy theories about Israel doing it on purpose. None of those conspiracy theories hold water, in my view. Where it cast a shadow on the 73 war was that the chief of staff, or I should say the chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff of the American Army at the time, was an admiral named Thomas Moorer. They rotate who gets to be chairman. One time it's the head of the Navy, one time the Army. At this time, it happened to be the head of the Navy. Tom Moorer absolutely hated Israel. And he even made statements after he retired that could be interpreted as anti-Semitic. He talked about how the Jews control everything through their lobby in Washington and so on. And one of the theories for why he is so hostile to Israel was that the USS Liberty incident really just soured him on Israel completely.
I agree with you, by the way, that Israel didn't mean to do it, but
Right.
really strafed and nearly sank a U.S. ship, and dozens of U.S. Navy men were killed, including cryptographers and military spy people, you might say, who listened in on all the communications during the war. But many in the Navy do still think Israel did it intentionally, but I can't see why, and spoke to a lot of people who said, no way.
Yeah, there are various theories. I could describe a few of them. It mostly happened because in those days when they tracked whatever you want to call it, a blip on a radar, they used an old, the old compasses we had as kids. I don't know if the kids use them anymore, where you track it, where you make a circle. That is what they used. And the guy made a mistake of about a half an inch. So they thought the ship was going much faster than it was. Today, of course, it's all computerized. It could never happen.
They thought it was Egyptian, as you say.
They thought it was an Egyptian warship because it was going, they thought so quickly. Actually, it was barely moving at all. It also did bear resemblance to an Egyptian ship. For people who want to read about it, the Israeli pilot who led the main attack on the ship, his name was Yiftach Spector, and he wrote a memoir. I don't know if it's been translated into English, but he describes it. It's not a good feeling to know that you accidentally killed people, but that's what happened.
Was Spector one of the pilots who then destroyed the Iraqi nuclear reactor in 81?
You remembered that. He was indeed, although his was the only plane that didn't get the bomb on the target, because by then, he writes, he was 41 years old. And he said it was the only time he, I guess, kind of passed out from the G-forces, and he realized that he was too old for this already. But he's one of Israel's legendary pilots. A lot of Yiftach Spector stories.
Mm-hmm. Was Netanyahu involved as a soldier during the war?
He was. He was in the most elite unit in the Israeli army. It's called Sayeret Matkal. He fought in the Golan Heights, did not see a lot of action. For whatever bizarre reason, and there's no good answer to this, in the war of attrition, Israel made fabulous use of its commandos, and they did some pretty incredible things. They launched, I forget how many missions, I think 42 missions or some number like that in Egypt. They only lost men to hostile fire twice. But for some reason, they did not use them as much in the Yom Kippur War. In fact, they barely used them at all. So he was out there, but he didn't do anything, particularly noteworthy.
Reminder, he was involved in counterterrorism missions, including rescuing hostages at the airport in Tel Aviv. And of course, Bibi's brother, Yoni, was the leader of the mission to rescue the hostages in Entebbe, Uganda, 3 years later in 76.
Correct. And Bibi was wounded, in fact. It was the plane was called the Sabina hijacking. The Arabs hijacked a Sabina airliner, flew it to
Want to
Israel.
hear an irony, right? Was his commander Ehud Barak? Yeah, I mean, I know they were
Commander was
together in
Ehud
that
Barak.
unit. And now Barak, who was defense minister under Netanyahu, hates Netanyahu. There are just so many ironies.
There are many. And in fact, if you go to the Yom Kippur War, Sharon was in command of the army that crossed the Suez Canal. The guy who led the tank force against the Egyptians, so he was 2 levels below, he was a lieutenant colonel, was Amram Mitzna, who ran against Sharon in the 2003 election. So, I guess Israel, it's a small world. But if you want to also just think for a minute of just how crazy this stuff is and how you just can't make it up, think about how in 1976, Bibi Netanyahu went to the funeral of the fallen hero. There he met the defense minister of Israel, who was Shimon Peres. And 20 years later, almost to the day, Netanyahu beat Peres in the election for prime minister in one of the closest elections in Israeli history. You can't make this stuff up. If you put it in a novel, your editor would kick you down the stairs. Like, this just can't happen, but it did, and it does. It's unbelievable.
Let's see, we're running towards the end of this program, but let's see if we can just sneak in a few more questions. I'm sorry, we won't be able to get to all of them. Someone says, I flew into Israel to be a civilian replacement on a kibbutz during the war. I flew a mostly empty El Al flight. I was told that the plane was carrying armaments to the war. Is that true?
I wouldn't have any way of knowing for sure one way or the other. There were El Al flights that were bringing weapons. However, most of the weapons that reached Israel came across on C-5 Galaxies. Up till the 73 war, the C-5 Galaxy was considered to be a boondoggle, this really stupid weapons program that had no use. After the 73 war, everyone realized, wow, what a good thing that we built this C-5 Galaxy. What a terrific tool this will be for fast dispatch to meet global crises in the future.
For the United States, yeah.
Yeah, for everyone.
Through your 20 years of research, is there one thing that really stands out as the most surprising thing that you learned?
There were many, many, many things. The one thing I would say is the most surprising is just how wrongheaded the view is in Israel towards the role of Golda Meir. Israelis all believe that Golda could have made peace before 73. That was the fundamental blunder. When I started this project, there are a lot of things in history where, it's kind of ambiguous. You could interpret it in multiple ways. I thought it would be that. It wasn't. It could not be clearer that there was absolutely no way to make peace before 73. Her decision-making in the war was exceptional. She literally ran the table. She got everything right. If she had made one mistake, Israel would have lost. I cannot understand why Israelis still rank her always at the bottom whenever they rank their prime ministers. Ben-Gurion and Begin are always battling it out at the top. Golda always comes in dead last. I think they've got that completely upside down.
Thank you. And as we wrap up, someone would like to know what you think is today's most dangerous threat to Israel.
No question, the Iranian bomb. Not even close. If Iran gets a bomb, there is a real chance they would use it. I think part of the threat is, I'm old enough to remember as a kid, TV shows like The Twilight Zone and all these movies that were made scaring us to death that there might be a bomb. And of course, it never happened. Everybody was a rational actor. And I think a certain complacency has started to seep in. Yeah, I don't think we've had the bomb. It's been around a long time. It'll all be okay. Iran is a very, very different nut to crack. These guys are not necessarily rational actors. Mutually assured destruction for some of them is an incentive. It is not a deterrent. I would be very, very concerned about that.
Great. Well, Uri and Dan, thank you so much for this really, really great conversation. I know a lot of people have written in and said thank you as well. Just to remind people, his book is 18 Days in October, the Yom Kippur War and How It Created the Modern Middle East. I'll be sending out a follow-up email that will include a link to the book as well as a link to the recording of this program. Please go to Moment Mag for more information about upcoming programs, including next week's program on ecological Judaism. Again, thank you both for joining us. Thank you to the audience, and we will see you next time.
Thank you.
Thank you.